بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي هدى والصلاة والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى خصوصا على سيد الرسل وخاتم الأنبياء وعلى آله وصحبه الذين اجتباه. أما بعد. Inshallah, we'll be conducting a Fiqh of Zakat session today. And there's a few objectives that we want to be mindful of, what we want to get out from the session. First is we want to understand how to calculate both the zakat liability and eligibility. So when we say eligibility, we mean a person is eligible to receive zakat. And when we say liability, we mean a person's liable to give zakat. That's the terminology we're going to use consistently: eligible to receive and liable to give. We also want to recognize how to properly disperse zakat to valid recipients. So we'll identify who are the valid recipients, and then how do you give that money to them. And we want to be confident in our zakat calculations. A lot of times people feel like, I need a zakat calculator, I need a TurboTax version of something that does my zakat calculation for me. Zakat calculation is actually not very complicated once you just understand it. And it's not very difficult to understand it. So as we will go through the workshop, we'll talk about how to calculate zakat and such. Then at the end, we will also then do some practical scenarios and do the calculation of zakat in different scenarios. So the agenda will be, first, just understanding what zakat is. How do you determine liability? How do you determine eligibility? Who are the valid recipients of zakat? And then we'll run through certain scenarios as we talked about. Now, understanding zakat. Before we get to that, let me throw out some questions to you that I want you to be mindful of as we're going through this session. So as we're going through the session, I want you to think about these questions and think about what is the answer to them. And as we go through the session, we're not going to pause and say the answer to this question is X. The answers are going to come themselves, but keep a lookout for these questions. So the first question is, can you give zakat to a masjid? And here meaning that, can the masjid consume the zakat? Can you give zakat to the masjid so that they consume it for their operating expenses and such? Does a person have to pay zakat on jewelry if it is in use? So a woman, woman's wearing certain necklaces or gold ring or such, is that a zakatable asset? Is there zakat on the rental property value? A person owns an apartment building and has rented the apartments out. Do they have to give zakat on the value of that apartment building? Very common question people ask. Is there zakat on 401k? And then there's going to be subsequent questions that people ask from that, which would be, if there is zakat on 401k, then what is the value on how do you calculate the value of 401k? Can you subtract the early withdrawal penalty and things of that nature? Now jumping right in, linguistically, zakat has different meanings. It means blessing, like barakah, it means purification, it means praise, madh. Okay? And all these meanings linguistically also apply when a person gives zakat as well. It's a means of blessings, a means of purification of wealth, it's a praiseworthy act, and so on. But the legal meaning, the shari'i meaning of zakat is transfer of ownership of a portion of one's wealth to a deserving individual with its intention. And this definition is very deliberate. Okay? Each part of that definition has a certain purpose to it. So, transfer of ownership. In zakat, there must be a complete transfer of ownership without any strings attached. It has to be what's called tamlik, not ibaha. You have to make it the other person's ownership. So let me give you an example. If a person sets up a soup kitchen where people can come and eat as much as they want, that doesn't constitute as zakat, okay? Because you have given people permission to take from it, but you haven't given it to them as in that this food here is your ownership. You can take it, eat it, give it to somebody else, whatever, right? You've simply given people permission to come and consume of something. That's what's called ibaha, that's not tamlik. You have to actually say, here's the money, or here's whatever you're giving in zakat. This is now yours. You do with it as you want. You have no restrictions from my side. So it's transfer of ownership of a portion of one's wealth. Okay? So it's 2.5% of net zakatable assets. Okay? And we'll talk about net zakatable assets in a little bit, but it's 2.5% of net zakatable assets to a deserving individual. Okay? Person has to be eligible to receive zakat to whom you're giving, and it has to be an individual. You cannot give zakat to a masjid, an institution, some public welfare, for them to consume it. Yes, what happens a lot of times is a masjid will collect zakat and then it will disperse it to valid recipients. That's not what we're talking about. That's fine. Right? They're just acting as an agent to carry out somebody else's, whatever they have delegated to them. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about here as in a masjid or an institution cannot consume the zakat for its operational expenses and such. And this a deserving individual must be a Muslim. Okay. Other forms of sadaqah can be given to non-Muslims, but zakat is specifically for Muslims with its intention. Okay. That a person must have intention at the time when they're discharging their zakat. Okay. So it's transfer of ownership of a portion of one's wealth to a deserving individual with its intention. And this must be paid immediately, meaning that a person should not unnecessarily delay the paying of that zakat. Okay? Recipients, people whose right it is that they must be given the zakat, and that right should not be unnecessarily delayed. And we know that zakat, it's fard on people who are liable for it, and it's one of the pillars of Islam. Right? It became fard in the second year after Hijrah, and people know about the obligation of zakat and the virtues of it and such, but it's important to know that a person should not unnecessarily delay paying of that zakat. And the purposes are many. Right? It purifies a person from sins, from any impermissible wealth that they may have accidentally accumulated. Allah Ta'ala mentioned in Surah Tawbah, تَخُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ إِنَّ صَلَاتَكَ سَكْنٌ لَهُمْ وَاللَّهُ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ. Allah Ta'ala mentions there that take from their wealth, the sadaqah here referring to zakat, تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا. Right? This is something that's going to be a means of their purification. And there's other benefits and wisdoms and such, right? That a person realizes, the wealthy who are giving realize what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed them with. The poor realize that even though they may not have money, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still creates avenues for them to receive money and still provides them that sustenance. وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا وَيَرْزُقْهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَحْتَسِبُ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides avenues and will provide risk from people from avenues that they don't necessarily have imagined or were expecting it. Now, in a simplified manner, you can think of, on your balance sheet, you have revenue minus expenses equals profit. We're going to take that same approach for zakat as well. So you have all of your zakatable assets minus all of your, valid debts and expenses. And when you take your zakatable assets and subtract those debts and expenses, then you get to the net zakatable assets figure. And if that net zakatable assets figure is above a certain number or below a certain number, then there's certain rulings with it. But nonetheless, here's how we're going to talk about then this equation, if you will. So we're going to talk first about that first part of the equation, which is what's equivalent to the revenue aspect, or what are all your zakatable assets. And zakatable assets, perhaps the clearest of it, is money. Okay, this could be cash that you have in hand, or it could be cash that you have deposited in your bank accounts. Okay. And this also includes a loan that you may have given out to someone and you're expecting to be paid back. That's also a zakatable asset. Next, you have investments. Okay. So this could be stocks, or it could be your 401k. Okay. Now, in 401k, you look at what's the value of the portfolio, and you have to, the individual contribution, the employee contribution to the 401k is a zakatable asset. The employer's vested contribution is also a zakatable asset. If it's not vested, then any unvested portion is not zakatable. Okay, that's technically somebody else's ownership. It's not your ownership, and that is not going to be zakatable. Okay, so in 401k, you give on your individual contribution and the employer's vested contribution as well. Any gold or silver, the value of the gold or the value of the silver is zakatable. Okay, so any other alloy in it or such, the value of the chain in it or such, not necessarily that, any actual gold or silver, the value of that gold or silver is a zakatable asset. And it doesn't matter whether it's in use or it's not in use. There isn't zakat on other precious metals besides gold and silver. Okay, for example, there is no zakat on diamonds. Diamonds are not a zakatable asset. Gold and silver are zakatable assets. And then in property, only property that was purchased with the intention of resale is a zakatable asset, even if it's not sold yet. Okay? So any property that a person acquires for any other purpose is not a zakatable asset. So for example, a person bought a new house and now they're intending on selling the old house. That old house was purchased with the intention of living in it. When it was purchased, it wasn't purchased with the intention of resale necessarily. It wasn't as a business inventory, right? This is more of a person buys, a home with the intention of fixing it up and putting it back, flipping it and putting it back on the market, right? That's the kind of resale property that is zakatable. If it's not for that purpose, it is not, that resale purpose, it is not a zakatable asset, even if at some point in the future you decide to sell it. Likewise, if a person has any rental property, the value of the rental property is not zakatable. Yes, when you give that property out on rent and you collect, income, the rental income from it, that rental income will go to the bank and it'll count as money and cash in the bank or such. That would be zakatable. But the value of the rental property itself, the apartment building, for example, that is not a zakatable asset. Likewise, any property that's meant for living, like your own house, or even if a person has multiple homes, a person has a vacation home in Florida or elsewhere, that is not a zakatable asset. Business inventory is zakatable. Okay? So the business property, business machinery, things of that nature, these aren't zakatable. But the business inventory, or anything that forms part of the finished product that goes on the shelf, if you will, okay, that is business inventory. That will be zakatable. Okay? So if you sell a product and that product goes within, a certain plastic and a cardboard box and such, all of these material as well count toward that business inventory. These are zakatable assets, okay? But not on the machinery that's used to produce that inventory, or the property, the value of the factory or the where the business is located, that is not zakatable. Only the inventory is zakatable. So that's the first part of the equation, the zakatable assets. And now we come to the second portion, where you're going to subtract out from that, which is valid debts and expenses. One of those valid debts and expenses is money that you owe to other people. So for example, you've taken a loan from someone and now they're asking you to pay it back, and you have to pay that money back. That's a debt that you owe to other people, and that is valid subtraction. Also, what is a valid subtraction is any unpaid zakat. So if you didn't pay zakat from last year for some reason, when you're doing your zakat calculation this year, you're going to subtract that amount out. Okay, it's a valid debt that is on you that you can subtract. And these are generally where you subtract money that's owed to people, right? Zakat is also owed to people. as opposed to money that you owe, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the sense that if a person has any kafara to pay, or a person took a vow, another to, these aren't subtracted, but loans to other people or unpaid zakat, this is a valid subtraction that you're going to include in your zakat calculation. Likewise, you will subtract any incurred expenses. Okay, you don't subtract potential expenses or money that you have set aside for future expense. For example, if a person has set aside some money for Hajj, for marriage, whether their own or their children's, or doesn't matter, right? Some money that a person has set aside to use for some future event, that's not a valid subtraction. You only subtract incurred expenses. Okay? Potential expenses are not subtracted. Okay? What we also clarify here, a few things, is sometimes you have incurred an expense, but you may not have gotten the bill for it yet. So for example, you swiped the credit card, you incurred that debt now, you owe that money, but the credit card bill is going to come after a couple of weeks, for example. This is an incurred expense. Even if the bill hasn't come in the mail yet, you can subtract this. Okay? Or a person has any other expense that, for example, you take something like a property tax. Okay, these are paid in arrears, meaning that when you stayed in the property last year, you have to now give the tax for that this year. So that's an expense that has now already been incurred, and the bill will be coming soon. That is a valid subtraction. Okay. When we talk about potential expenses, okay, note that when we talk in the context of a 401k, if you subtract the money out early, you will incur a penalty. If you don't withdraw that money out early, then you won't incur a penalty. That penalty is a potential expense, okay? Meaning that if you withdraw the 401k, then you will incur it. If you don't withdraw the 401k, then you will not incur it. Okay? Hence, that penalty is not going to be subtracted. Okay? Likewise, taxes are not going to be subtracted either. Right? There's no mutalaba for that yet. There's no, you're not being asked to pay that money at the moment. That money is completely yours still. Any early withdrawal penalty or taxes are not subtracted from the 401k. You can imagine this as, if a person, when they're calculating their zakat, is in a foreign country. Okay, so a person went for Umrah, and their zakat year came, and they're calculating their zakat, and they say, okay, if I were to wire all my money over here while I'm in Makkah Mukarramah, so then let's say if I have $1,000, and to bring the money over is going to cost me, $100, let's just say, then I'm going to say that my wealth is $900. And I'm going to pay zakat on $900. And then a couple of weeks later, they go back to their country, and again, because they never actually wired that money over, never actually incurred that expense, and they go back after a couple of weeks and they have $1,000 in their account still. Okay? It's similar to that. You're not going to keep subtracting a significant portion from your 401k every year, saying that if I were to withdraw this is what I would lose, because it's a potential expense. You haven't actually incurred that expense, and now when you most likely will withdraw at the valid age of 59 and a half, or whatever it may be for the person by the time that they're retiring, for all these years they've been paying zakat in a lesser amount when that potential expense was never actually incurred. So potential expenses are not incurred, potential expenses are not subtracted, only incurred expenses are subtracted. Now, who is liable for zakat? Now, we did the aspect of the revenue minus expenses equals net profit or profit. Same way we did what are the zakatable assets, what are valid debts and expenses, and now we come to the net zakatable assets. Okay? Before we get to that, some other questions I want you to think about. if someone's not liable for zakat, does that automatically mean that they are eligible for zakat? Meaning, can you either be in one of two camps? You're either liable for zakat or you're eligible for zakat, either liable to give or eligible to receive zakat. Or can there be a third camp where you are neither liable to give zakat, nor are you eligible to receive zakat? For ease, can a person just say that, you know what, beginning of the year, January 1st, every year I'm going to give my zakat? Can a person set a date like that? Also, if a person has, let's say, jewelry that is equal to the nisab, the quantum, the minimum that a person must have in order to be liable to give zakat, but they don't have any cash on hand, is that person still liable to give zakat, or is that person eligible to receive zakat? So they have jewelry that's equal to, that adds up in value, but they don't have any cash in hand. Can you give them zakat? Can you give zakat to your siblings? Can a person give zakat to their brother, their sister? So inshallah, the answers to these will come. You know, as you follow along, then you'll realize that these answers have been discussed as well. Okay? For liability of zakat, a person must be sane, have the mental capacity, must be an adult, and it's only on Muslims. And they must possess the nisab, or the quantum, for the liability of zakat, okay, which is equivalent to about, you know, close to 88 grams of gold. And this is the gold standard. This is the, you know, there's amongst the ulama, there's some discussion about should you use the silver standard or the gold standard for determining what the nisab is. And you know, you can look at the Fiqh Academy resolution that discusses and explains why we use the gold standard. Okay? So as long as a person has, when you do your zakat calculation, take all your zakatable assets minus your debts and expenses, and you come to that net zakatable asset number. If that net zakatable asset number is higher than the value of about 87.48 grams of gold, which currently, you know, as of mid-May is around $4,800 to $5,000. If it's above that number, then that person will be liable to give zakat. One point of confusion for a lot of people is this concept of, well, I must have zakat, you know, I must have money for 1 year. Okay. Know that what that means is you must have nisab at the beginning of the year, and you must have nisab at the end of the year. Fluctuations that happen throughout the year are ignored. Okay? It doesn't mean that every single dollar that I earn must be held onto for 1 year. That's not even practical to calculate in any manner. What that means is you must have nisab at the beginning of the year, and you must have nisab at the end of the year, and you ignore the fluctuations that happen in the middle. Okay. And there's some exceptions, like, you know, if you go down to 0 or negative such, it's different. But general, you know, fluctuations that happen throughout the year, money comes in, you write a check, money goes out. Those fluctuations are all ignored. Okay, you will look at zakat as a snapshot, right? Like on a balance sheet, meaning that on the date when your zakat is due, and this date is not set by the Gregorian calendar, right? Our normal quote unquote calendar. It's based off of the lunar calendar, the Islamic calendar. Okay, so you can't set January 1st as your zakat date, for example. It must be the 15th of Ramadan, for example, or any other date during the Islamic calendar, but it has to be based off of the lunar calendar, the Islamic calendar. Okay? And what you say is, on that date, if on that same date last year you had nisab, and then on that date this year you have nisab, then I'm going to pay zakat. I'm going to pay zakat based off of what I have today on this date. And you ignore the fluctuations that happen throughout the year. Also, what's important to note is a person may be liable to give zakat even if they don't possess liquid assets. Okay? Meaning that a person has a lot of money in stocks. A person has a lot of money in jewelry, in gold, for example, but they don't have a lot of cash on hand. that doesn't mean they don't have to give zakat. They're still liable to give zakat. Okay? And this happens a lot with in two situations essentially. The second one I'll talk about when we talk about eligibility, but the first one is when we talk about 401k. What happens is people's 401k accounts, mashallah, grow to such amounts that the zakat on that amount sometimes ends up being more than what they have in cash on hand, or it's a significant percent of the cash that they have on hand. And in that case, what the person is going to do is they're going to calculate, okay, how much zakat did I have to give on my 401k, and then make a note of that. And they can give essentially zakat on that 401k when they withdraw it, but they have to still give for each year. So on year one, they're going to say, for example, my 401k had $1,000, 2.5% of that, I should have given $25. Now year two, I have now 401k balance grew, I have $1,100. Zakat for year two is going to be $1,100 minus the 25 that I didn't give last year. So the $1,075, and now 2.5% of $1,075. And you continue to do that each year. And eventually when you withdraw the 401k, you will give the money for all the prior unpaid years. Okay? So you can either give zakat on that 401k every year, or if the liquidity becomes an issue, then you can give the zakat on that 401k when you withdraw it, but you have to give for each year. And the amount that you give ends up being the same. Okay? The calculation ends up being the same. A lot of people make mathematical problems in this area. They'll say things such as, well, 2.5% after 10 years, I'm going to end up giving 25% of my 401k. The math doesn't work that way, okay, and you can figure that out. But either way, it ends up being the same amount of money that you pay. The important thing is, just because you don't have the cash on hand doesn't mean that you're somehow not liable for the zakat anymore. Now, eligibility. It is possible for someone to not be liable for zakat, at the same time not be eligible for zakat either. Okay. The way we determine eligibility for zakat is very similar to how we calculate the liability, how we calculate the liability to give zakat, with slight difference. Okay. Remember, when we're doing the calculation for the liability to give zakat, we said we're going to include all the zakatable assets. Not every asset, all the zakatable assets. Okay, so for example, diamonds was not a zakatable asset. The vacation home was not a zakatable asset. The rental property was not a zakatable asset. However, when we're calculating the eligibility to receive zakat, so if somebody's, let's say, not liable to give zakat, now we say, okay, is that person eligible to receive zakat? Here, we're not going to include just zakatable assets. We're going to include all assets that are above one's necessity. So in this case, it'll be the cash, it'll be the stocks, it'll be the gold and silver and such, but it will also then be the value of the rental property. It will also be the value of the vacation home. It will also be the value of diamonds and so on. And you will include all of those, and then you have your valid debts and expenses that you subtract, and then you look at, okay, is that net amount now below Nisab? And if it is below Nisab, then a person is eligible to receive zakat. So it's the same calculation. The only difference ends up being, for liability, you include zakatable assets. For eligibility, you include all assets above one's necessities. And necessities include, for example, the house that you live in, the car that you need, and such. Again, lack of liquidity or liquid assets doesn't make a difference on the ruling itself. Okay? Meaning that if a person, has a couple of vacation homes and they have a rental property, and that amount adds up in the hundreds of thousands or the million, above $1 million or so, but they don't have a lot of cash on hand, that person's not going to be eligible to receive zakat. We're not going to give zakat to that person. Okay? The liquidity here is, the cash on hand is not going to determine whether someone's eligible or not. And the most common scenario that happens with this is with women who have a lot of jewelry, but don't have a lot of cash on hand. Okay? that doesn't make them eligible to receive zakat. Okay? And yes, granted that they don't necessarily want to sell the jewelry, but you must recognize that that person does have sufficient assets. Okay, they have wealth. And even if they don't want to convert that wealth from one type to another type, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make them now eligible to receive zakat, right? Otherwise people are just going to take all their money and convert it into cash and then say, okay, I can take zakat because I don't have cash on hand. Okay? So that's one of the most common scenarios to note for. Just because you don't have cash on hand doesn't necessarily mean that you're eligible to receive zakat. Now, who are the valid recipients to receive zakat? Okay. In the famous ayah, Allah mentioned Surah Tawbah, that إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل فريضة من الله والله عليم حكيم. Allah mentions different categories of zakat recipients. Okay. First is the faqir, or that indigent person, that poor person who possesses less than the nisab amount. Okay, so meaning that person has some money, but it's less than the nisab, and hence they're eligible to receive zakat. You also have the masakin, the miskin, that poor person who has no wealth at all. And you also have the gharimin, those people who are in debt. You have then the wayfarer. Okay, this is a person who, is a traveler and they're in some other place outside of their homeland and they've lost their wealth and now they've become poor in their current state. Meaning, for example, a person who travels to a foreign country and Allah forbid, they're robbed and they lose their passport and all their wealth and such. So although they have money back home, they have no access to that money, and in their current state, they're just completely poor. That person is a valid recipient of zakat. Or as Allah, and this is the Ibn Sabil, or as Allah mentions also in the ayah, that وَفِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, fi sabilillah refers to that Muslim soldier who's cut off from his troops. Okay? So a person who's a Muslim soldier who's out in battle, and now he's been cut off from his troops. Okay? And he doesn't have enough money to rejoin the Muslim army. This person is somebody who is a valid recipient of zakat. Okay? Fi sabilillah could also refer to a haji, a person who's gone out for hajj, and now he's been cut off from his group. And one thing you'll notice between these five is that these aren't mutually exclusive. Okay? That some of these are more specific forms of other, just different forms of a broader category. Okay? So the first three are all poor people, just at different levels. One level is somebody who is poor, but they have some money still, but it's still below nisab, so they're still considered poor. Another case, the person doesn't have any money. Another case, a person is in the negatives. But in any of these cases, the person is still poor. And the last two are that person who, although they may have wealth back home, is in a current state where they have been, they're cut off from their wealth. Okay? So just know that the categories mentioned in the ayah are not necessarily completely mutually exclusive. They're just different forms. Okay? Now you have certain recipients who are not what we'd say inapplicable. Okay? So the official zakat collector of the Muslim state, the amilin, according to a lot of the ulama, the Islamic charities who collect money and such don't count as the official zakat collector of the Muslim state. Okay? So they can't consume zakat. Okay, zakat is for individuals. A slave who's working toward freedom, it's one of the recipients that Allah mentions in the ayah. However, we don't really have this today. Okay, it's inapplicable. Okay, if this was hypothetically found somewhere, they would be a valid recipient, but we just don't have that. And those whose hearts are to be reconciled. Okay, this the ulama mentioned has not been a valid recipient since the Khilafah of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. This is something that's called intifal al-hukm bi intifal al-illa, that this ruling for giving zakat to those whose hearts were to be reconciled was for a certain purpose, and that purpose was no longer applicable once Islam strengthened during the Khilafah of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Invalid recipients, a non-Muslim, okay, can't give zakat to a non-Muslim. Somebody who's a Sayyid, a Hashimi, somebody who's from the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ, they should be helped, but ideally should be helped from out of the goodness of one's own heart and from sadaqah and such, not from zakat. The ulama have mentioned that due to unfortunate circumstances where people don't are not, if they're not helping these people from sadaqah, then ideally these people should they should be helped, but not from zakat. Okay? A person cannot give zakat to their spouse. A husband cannot give to the wife cannot give to the husband. Within a family tree, if you imagine going up and going directly down, okay, so your ascendants and your descendants, if you will, okay, these people are not eligible, or they're not a valid recipient of your zakat. Okay, so a person cannot give zakat to their own father, their own grandfather, and a person cannot give zakat to their own son, their grandson, and so on. People who are sideways on your family tree, so like siblings, for example, nieces and nephews, okay, uncles and aunts, yes, they are valid recipients of your zakat. But anyone who's directly above or below you in your family tree, they are not valid recipients of your zakat. Again, zakat will be for individuals, for people, so organizations or masjids cannot consume zakat. They can collect and then redirect that zakat to valid recipients, so they can act as an agent, but they cannot consume that. Okay? And as a general best practice, it's good for a person to give zakat to their relatives. So for example, a person's own siblings who may be in need. It's good to you have multiple rewards from the aspect of giving zakat, but also the aspect of giving your relatives. Likewise, a person's neighbors. It's also good to give zakat to those who are more religious or in religious services who may be in need. It's good to give zakat to them as well. That stated, let's run through some actual scenarios and let's do some calculations. Okay, so now the application of what we discussed. For all these scenarios, let's just assume that Nisab is $500. Okay. First scenario, Zaid has $499 in his bank. He's got a house that is worth $100,000 and he's got a car that's worth $10,000. Is he liable? Okay, remember, liable to give, eligible to receive. Is he liable to give zakat? If so, how much? And if he's not liable to give zakat, is he eligible to receive zakat? Okay. So let's see what are his zakatable assets here. Okay, his zakatable assets are the cash in the bank. Remember, the house that he's living in is not a zakatable asset. His car is also a necessity, is not a zakatable asset. So essentially, all of his zakatable assets here are $499, and that's less than the nisab. So he's not liable to give zakat. So now let's switch to see if he's eligible to receive zakat. $499, the cash we look at. For eligibility, also, we don't look at those things that are a person's essentials, so the house, the car, and such. So even for eligibility, he has a total of $499, and since that's less than nisab, in this case, Zaid is eligible to receive zakat. Okay. Take the second one. Zaid has $100 in the bank, he's got a house, and he's got then 2 vacation properties. Each vacation property is worth $50,000. Is he liable for zakat? If yes, how much? If no, is he eligible to receive zakat? Okay. So now in this case, remember, cash is a zakatable asset. A house that a person lives in is not a zakatable asset, as we already spoke about. Vacation properties, okay, in this case, each one worth $50,000. Remember, a person's vacation properties are not zakatable assets. Resale property is zakatable asset, but a person owns a second house, a person owns a vacation house or such, regardless of their value, these are not zakatable assets. So in this case, the total zakatable assets that Zayd has is actually just the $100 in the bank. So he's not liable to give zakat. Now let's see if he's eligible to receive zakat. So now for eligibility, remember, we don't just add zakatable assets, we add all assets beyond one's necessity. So $100 in the bank is included. And those vacation properties that, although they're not zakatable assets, they're still above one's necessities, so those will be included. In this case, then Zayd has $100 plus the $100,000 from the two vacation properties. So that's above Nisab. In this case, you cannot give zakat to Zayd. He's not eligible to receive zakat. So now this is a scenario where a person is neither liable to give zakat, but at the same time, they're also not eligible to receive zakat. Third scenario. Zayd has $250 in the bank. He's got the house. He's got one rental property worth $50,000. And he has a total of $300 in rental income in addition to his bank balance. How much zakat will he pay? So let's add up his zakatable assets. The zakatable assets are the cash in the bank, the $250, and we already said house is not a zakatable asset. Rental property is not a zakatable asset. Rental income is a zakatable asset. So he has $250 plus $300. Okay, so that's $550. He's going to pay 2.5% of $550. Okay, and you don't have to do the math in your head, but just 2.5% of the $550. So number 4. Zayd has $250 in the bank. He's got the house. He's got one resale property worth $50,000 and one property for rent worth $75,000. How much zakat will he pay? You already know the house is not a zakatable asset. Okay. And from the last question, you also know that rental property is not a zakatable asset. But resale property, however, is a zakatable asset. So here, Zayd's zakatable assets are the cash, the $250, plus the resale property worth $50,000. Okay. Rental property is not zakatable asset. So he's going to have to pay 2.5% of $50,000 plus $250. Okay. Now, Zayd has $10,000 in the bank. He's got a factory property that's worth $100,000. He's got machinery worth $50,000, and he has inventory worth $5,000. How much zakat should he pay? Okay. Now we've got the business scenario. Again, remember, even in a business, inventory is a zakatable asset. The machinery used to produce that inventory is not a zakatable asset. The property value of where the business operates is not a zakatable asset. Only the inventory is a zakatable asset. So in this case, Zayd's zakatable assets are the $10,000 that he has in the bank and the $5,000 that he has in inventory. Okay, not the property value, not the machinery value. So it will be 10,000 plus 5,000, 15,000, 2.5% of $15,000. 401k question. Zayd has 10,000 in the bank. He's got $5,000 in his 401k, of which 2,500 was contributed by him and 2,500 was the company match. He's got machinery worth 20,000. He's got inventory worth 2,500. So now we're starting to add on, right? There is a $1,000 fine to withdraw the 401k at this time. How much zakat should he pay if the 401k is vested? And how much zakat should he pay if the 401k is unvested? So for this one, we're going to have to do two calculations, okay? In two scenarios, the vested scenario and the unvested scenario. But regardless of those two scenarios, we know that the cash in the bank is a zakatable asset. We know that the employee contribution, meaning the money that Zayd put in, is a zakatable asset. We know machinery is not a zakatable asset. And we know that the inventory is a zakatable asset. So cash is a zakatable asset. Employee contribution is a zakatable asset. Inventory is a zakatable asset. Machinery is not a zakatable asset. Also, we know that the $1,000 fine is a potential expense. It's not an incurred expense. Hence, it is not a valid subtraction. Therefore, in the case where the 401k is vested, then we're going to add the $10,000 in the bank plus the $2,500 that is Zaid's contribution plus the $2,500 that is the company match as well because it's vested, plus the inventory that's worth $2,500. We're not adding machinery and we are not subtracting the early withdrawal penalty. Okay. So it'll be the 10,000 plus the 5,000 complete 401k plus the 2,500 in machinery, or sorry, $2,500 in inventory. That adds up to 17,500 and it'll be 2.5% of that. The difference now in the second scenario, which is if it's unvested, is that the company's match is no longer included. So we will only include the cash in the bank and the 2,500 that is the employee contribution, Zaid's contribution, but we're not going to include the company match. We're not including machinery, and we will include inventory. And same thing, we don't subtract the early withdrawal penalty. So in this case, it'll be 10,000 plus 2,500 plus 2,500. So it'll be then 15,000 and 2.5% of that. Okay. We'll just do two more. Zaid has $400 in the bank. His wife has $40,000 in gold and silver. How much zakat should he pay? Okay. The answer is not 40,400 times 2.5%. Remember, zakat is an individual obligation. It's not a family obligation. Okay, meaning the entire family is not going to put their assets together and come up with a single zakat number. Zakat is per individual. So Zaid is going to calculate his own zakat. His wife is going to calculate her own zakat. So if we're talking about how much zakat should Zaid pay, then we say, okay, what are Zaid's zakatable assets? It's only $400. His wife's jewelry is not his. That's his wife's. She will include that in her own calculation. But for Zaid, all he has is $400 in the bank. He is not liable to give zakat because that's less than the nisab of 500 that we've said here. In fact, Zaid may be eligible to receive zakat, but he's definitely not liable to give zakat. Okay? And that's irrespective of his wife's status. And finally, Zainab has $10,000 in the bank, gold that she wears worth 50,000, silver that she does not wear worth 500, and diamonds worth 30,000. How much zakat should she pay? Okay. And every time I do this, somebody asks, can I link them up with Zainab? Zainab here is just a made-up person. These are made-up numbers. I don't know Zainab, or the Zainab as described here. Okay. So in this case, $10,000 in the bank is a zakatable asset. Gold is a zakatable asset. Okay. Silver is a zakatable asset. And remember, with gold and silver, it does not matter whether they're in use or not in use, whether a person is wearing them or not wearing them. It's zakatable nonetheless. Okay. And diamonds are not zakatable assets, right? Other precious metals besides, gold and silver, these are not zakatable assets. So in this case, the diamonds are not included in the calculation. So it will be the 10,000 in the bank plus the 50,000 gold plus the $500 silver, which adds up to 60,500. It's 2.5% of that. And just a quick recap, we went over just understanding zakat, what is the definition of it, and the importance of that definition, because each part of that definition was very deliberate and had certain meanings behind it. We spoke about liability for zakat, eligibility for zakat, how to calculate that, and we spoke about who are the valid recipients of zakat, and then we ran through certain scenarios. And inshallah, make dua that with that understanding of the theory plus the application, that inshallah you feel a lot more comfortable in doing your own zakat and not relying on other people, not giving zakat based off of just random estimation, not relying on online calculators and things of that nature, that you feel comfortable in doing your zakat, and you understand that this is not a very complicated or difficult subject, that it's not like taxes where there's no point in learning it, just give me a software. It's not like that. This is part of our ibadah. We should know how to do it, and we should do it. We should be able to do it ourselves. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not made it difficult for us. So that, Jazakumullahu khairan. We pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows for this to be beneficial for us, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to discharge our zakat properly and accurately and in a timely manner, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts that from us. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.